Alright guys, welcome back to another video. This is 2.4. We're recapping the moth's gizmo and we're going to talk about something called selective pressure. So to get into the moth's gizmo, we know that at the beginning there were all these light colored trees, and so in order to camouflage, the moths were white and they were able to camouflage into the trees to hide from predators. So yeah, they were camouflaging, which means they were blending into the trees. They were this light color with like a little bit of pepper in them to blend into the trees. And then there were a lot of factories built during the Industrial Revolution, and in areas where that was happening, all the trees turned dark. They were covered in soot, and it killed all the lichen that was on the trees and turned them dark, and that made it that the darker moths were better able to blend into the trees, while the light moths were so much more visible that predators were hunting them more. So over time, the black moths now have this adaptation of being dark in color that was letting them camouflage. So they were better able to survive and reproduce in those areas. So those traits were then continued to pass on for generations, and over time, the black moth trait became more common. So that was only in areas where the factories were, right? There were still lots of areas in the country where there weren't any factories, and we could see that in those areas, the light trees were still light in color, and so these light moths, they still had the adaptation to camouflage in those areas, and so they stayed more common there. So this change in the environment from having all these light trees to having all these dark trees made it that there were certain traits that were better to have, right? This was the cause that affected all the dark moths to become more popular. And that change in the environment is called selective pressure. Selective pressure is the thing in the environment that causes there to be certain traits that are better for survival. So this is like the change in the environment that causes some traits to be better for survival. So here, the selective pressure was that the trees turned darker in color, and that made it that being a dark moth was better for survival. So if we're looking at this graphic organizer or this model to describe what happened in this case that made the dark moths become more common, first we need to say, what was the cause? The cause here, what caused dark moths to become more common? Our change here was that the trees got darker because of the soot from the factories. So in between, we have the trees got darker, and then the dark moths became more common. We're now asking, what was the mechanism? What was the process that caused this cause to cause the effect? So our mechanism here is natural selection. Dark moths were more likely to survive and reproduce, passing down the trait of being dark. What made them more able to survive? In this case, what made them more able to survive was that they were able to camouflage, hiding themselves from predators, so they were hunted less often than the light-colored moths. So let's talk about some key points here. Number one, once the trees became darker, dark moths were more able to survive and reproduce. So when they're more able to survive and reproduce, when they reproduce, they pass along the trait of being dark, and so that made being a dark moth more common. This is an example of natural selection because something in the environment was causing certain traits to be more beneficial for survival than others, so those traits became more common. And finally, the trees being dark was the selective pressure. So it was the thing in the environment that made being dark a better trait for survival. And remember that better trait for survival is another word for adaptation. So in this case, once the trees were dark, that was the selective pressure, and that caused being dark moth to be an adaptation. If you guys have any questions, make sure to write them down and ask us in class, and we'll see you next week.